The battle continues right here at home on climate change. What causes it? And is there something in our community that is leading to the causes for rising emissions? Well, here to break down the science, a passion that he saw early in his career to protect the environment. Tonight, we are speaking with senior scientist from the Center for Biological Diversity, Dr. John Fleming. So nice for you to be here with us this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Fleming. So first, I want to get straight to drilling and fracking. Again, for those who may not know what it is, can you talk a little bit about drilling and fracking, and is it actually harmful to our environment?
Sure, and thank you for having me. So drilling and fracking are, at the simplest form, methods of getting oil and gas out of the ground for our ultimate use in our cars and for our energy production. So you're drilling a hole in the ground. In the case of fracking, you're drilling a hole and then you're injecting fracking chemicals, breaking up rock and bringing up these fossil fuels. So the harms from drilling and fracking fall into two categories. One of those categories are the direct harms of climate change, in that in our process of drilling and extracting fossil fuels and burning those fossil fuels, we're producing CO2, which is contributing to climate change significantly. So some of those harms we already see all around us with the horrific fire season last year, the historic hurricane season last year, and now with this, what's going on as we speak, this historic cold weather that's hitting much of the United States. These can all be attributed to increasing climate change. And the second category of harms come directly from these processes of oil and gas extraction. And one way that occurs is with the chemicals used in oil and gas extraction. Many of these chemicals are toxic to people if they're exposed, and some of those harms include cancer, respiratory effects, reproductive effects, and the list goes on. And finally, in burning those fossil fuels, you get a lot of hazardous emissions. This recent study this year, in fact, out of Harvard actually says that in California, 34,000 people die prematurely from exposure to these emissions from fossil fuel use. So the harms are significant.
And now the Biden administration signed several executive actions on climate change. What are they trying to accomplish, and are these realistic goals?
Well, so first with the executive orders, the Biden administration is really putting a focus on climate change and centering it as a key factor to consider in all of our decision making going forward, because it's going to ultimately affect every sector across the nation. So what they're hoping to accomplish, well, first of all, is actually to save lives or at least, prevent so many premature deaths. As I already mentioned, we're talking about this exposure to emissions that is harmful to people. So if you work hard now to curb climate change and to curb the source of these emissions, then the more lives you're able to save. And a second goal to consider is climate justice, because we know that low income and communities of color tend to disproportionately feel the impacts from environmental burdens, social burdens, and the same is true for climate change. So through addressing climate change, we're also taking some of that undue burden off these communities, which are already overburdened.
So, and I think a question that a lot of people have, with the greener future, are we going to need to buy an electric car by 2035? I mean, is this something realistic that's actually going to be happening?
Sure. So that, the recent executive order by Governor Newsom was 100% electric vehicle sales by 2035, which means there will still at that time be electric vehicles on the road. With that said, I do feel that, it is very important that we make this transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So ultimately that will mean, in California, about 30% of our emissions are due to passenger vehicles. So if we are going to address the harms associated with emissions, we are going to have to address our transportation sector.
Now, we've talked a lot about the storms that are sweeping the nation, and everyone right now is talking about Texas and its electricity. But can you explain how theirs work? Because theirs is on a little bit of a different grid. And we know that they're obviously suffering some serious humanitarian crisis there. Can you talk about how their grid is different and what's going on in that state right now?
So in the U.S., there are essentially three electric grids. There's an eastern grid, which is the grid for east of the Rockies, and there's a western grid, and then there's a grid that's just for Texas. So by having their own grid, they're able to to avoid many federal regulations, since it's, their grid is simply within their state. But the problem with that now is, when they're having these shortfalls in electricity production, whereas another state might be able to essentially reach across state lines to get, to fill in that void in energy, Texas is unable to do that because it's on a grid all its own.
And how much are coal and natural gas actually to blame for what's going on in Texas? Because there are a lot of people saying a lot of different things. Some people are saying this is a bad example of renewable energy at work with turbines freezing. And some are saying, well, it was freezing because they weren't winterized. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So in Texas, over 50% of their energy comes from natural gas, actually, and something close to 20% comes from coal, and then about 25% comes from wind turbines. So if we're talking about what's most responsible for what's occurring there now, we really have to look at the predominant sources of energy, and that's natural gas and coal. And in terms of winterizing, yes, we know that wind turbines are in places that are cold. We know they're in, for instance, in Sweden, which is cold, in Canada, which is cold, even Antarctica, which is cold. So the issue with Texas is that they, built wind turbines, based on typical conditions in Texas. But we know that with climate change, those conditions are going to change. And over time, you're going to have to adapt. And that doesn't just mean wind turbines. That means natural gas lines, because actually a big problem in Texas right now is the freezing of natural gas lines. So if anything, you need a complete overhaul in terms of winterizing, infrastructure in Texas. And based on some estimates, actually 80% of the shortfall right now in energy in Texas, due to this storm, is from natural gas and coal. So it's not primarily wind that is, responsible for what's happening right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Fleming. We appreciate all of your insight.